Thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to have a good group show up for this. For those that missed last week, the basics of the format is that I'm going to do a sort of show and tell type presentation on the topic, and then we'll open it up to, lively discussion, as I like to say. And so if you can hold questions or comments to the end, I'll just sort of not race, but I'll go through my presentation part of it to sort of stimulate the conversation, and then we'll start talking about it. Especially this week. Last week, I was talking about this book, and we had the book and we looked through it. And so, we were sort of talking about SUDEC and talking about that particular body of work. And this week is more open because I'm wanted to talk about this idea of cameras and cameras as instruments, and how that can feed back into the type of work we make and the way we can either push against it or embrace it. And so I thought the best way would be to sort of set up some parameters and talk about how I think about this. And then we could open it up for people to talk about either, how the ways different cameras influence them, or the ways that they think about what they reach for and why, and how it changes the way they think about their photography, or maybe cameras they always lusted after and never got, and finally got their hands on and realized it wasn't for them. So there's a bunch of different ways we can go with it. So I do have some screenshots and pictures and stuff to go through. So I'm going to share my screen and go through that, and then I'll end and open it up and we can start talking about that. All right, I'm just going to do mute for everyone so that we just stay on my screen share. And here we go. All right, so if the screen sharing is working, you should now be seeing a fabulous photograph of a young B.B. King. And the reason why I wanted to start off with this is the idea of camera as instrument obviously came to me because I play guitar, and I think about how the different guitars I have can produce different sounds, and the fact that musicians often talk about their instruments in terms of, what makes things possible. So here's this young B.B. King, and then here he is as an older man switching to the electric guitar. A Bob Dylan early on, folk, later electric. There's a guitarist, Bob Brosman, who played wonderful resonator guitar instruments, and here's him with a sort of collection in the background. So there's this kind of thing of like a variety of designs, a variety of qualities of these instruments. But I also find that musicians often talk about their instruments more holistically. Like, yeah, you might hear someone talk about such and such humbucker pickup on a certain electric guitar, but they're much more likely to talk about, getting a certain Gretsch guitar from a certain era that, had this particular sound that another musician used, and that they wanted to, try to capture that lightning in a bottle by using the same thing. So the way I thought I'd break this down in terms of cameras was talking about the variety of designs similar to the guitar, the aspirational qualities that certain cameras have, and maybe part of the belief system of why we might want to use that camera. The feedback mechanisms that are built into the cameras in terms of like viewfinder, focusing, the size of it, how people react to it in the world, and things like that. This idea of having a limitation as an advantage or as a creative control, and how the camera plays into that, like what camera does or doesn't do, and how that's a creative control. And of course, having a stable of cameras, just like this picture of Joan Jett with all of her guitars behind her. And then I just thought I'd touch briefly on the idea of the smartphone and the crazy camera that has. So this is going to be, I'm just going to go through this quickly because most of us are familiar with the range of cameras out there, but I just thought it would, just for the conversation's point of view, just talk about some of the kind of varieties that we run across, like large format studio cameras, big, bulky, probably going to stay in the room, or these kind of studio large format cameras with multiple precision, everything clicks in just ever so, like this Linhof. This is a banquet camera, which we mentioned a little bit last week when we were talking about more panoramic formats. And here's a example banquet type photograph, that kind of long rectangle that's possible. And then like the camera that I had behind me, my 5x7 Deerdorf, here's an 8x10 Deerdorf, which is different than those other studio cameras in that it folds up. And it was like this idea that you could take it on your bicycle and go out into the world with it. And here's another Linhof Technica, which is also more of like that clamshell folding up, um, but highly precise and trying to keep the stuff from the studio camera. Here's a KB Canon 4x5 camera, which is similar to, I've got one of these, and it folds down even smaller. It's the tiniest little package, and you could easily still go out into the world with large format. So it's again, even though we talk about them in terms of maybe large, medium, and small, they have things that go back and forth between them, like, you know, the handheld kind of nature of a Crown Graphic. You can imagine using this camera the same way that someone else might be using, you know, a medium format camera or another rangefinder camera. This has a rangefinder built on top of it. So there are things that cross over that have nothing to do with the size of them, even though the size, of course, plays into it. This is some crazy 8x10 digital camera with the, you know, this monster digital back that looks very unwieldy, but I thought I'd throw that in as well. Here's a little bit of a transition camera, medium format-ish, large format-ish, can take roll film, could take individual sheets, the Polaroid land camera and all the various designs. But then on the medium format side, the idea was, you know, how do we make it a little bit more portable, not having to be on the tripod all the time, having to maybe be able to put it in a small bag or even in your pocket. And so I thought we could also talk about these kind of folding medium format cameras like this Bessa Voigtlander or this Fujifilm 645. There's also SLR medium format cameras, which are ungodly wieldy. I mean, this thing weighs, I think, 5 pounds or something more with all the lenses and accessories. But you do get that SLR, what you see is what you get, kind of looking through the lens, which some people find so intoxicating. And the top of this comes off, so you could also have this waist level viewfinder. And I think a lot of thinking about how you hold the camera up, do you block your face or do you have it down waist level? You know, all of these tie into, you know, how you're perceived as you're making the photograph and how, you know, how you interact with your photographing people or if you're trying to be a little more surreptitious. So another thing to consider. And then there's cameras like the Hasselblad, which like this was a camera for me when I was young that I lusted after, and it was always so prohibitively expensive. I never could get one. I'd always see them at shows, and it was that in the back of your mind, like thinking, oh, could I ever, you know, get up to this point of having something like this that would be like this ultimate tool. And you know, well, I did wind up using it, but there were other cameras that were very similar, like that all came apart, was modular design, you know, great lenses, and yet didn't have the same cult following. I mean, there's not many people out there that are like, oh yes, I want to use a Bronica, but you know, great technology, just didn't have the same qualities to it, right? Of course, had to throw in the twin lens rollies. I found these cute little ads for them. And then I find that this is the medium format camera that most people that are still shooting film that are in like graduate school and stuff, this is the Mamiya 7 II is sort of the one everyone kind of gravitates to because it's small, it's lightweight, rangefinder, beautiful optics, all of that kind of stuff. Even though with that rangefinder difference, your viewfinder's off so far to the side, but I guess people look over, don't mind that as much. I've never shot with one, but I've fixed a couple for people. And then there's this little jewel, the Makina, Blaubel Makina 6.7, which folds up real into a tight little package and I guess was the darling of Yale for many years. Then moving into smaller formats like 35 millimeter, which was, of course, as we probably know, was first called miniature cameras, which I thought was kind of cute. And, you know, the Leica kind of revolution, rangefinder cameras. Here's an ad for an M3. Picture yourself. I like that they use that word picture in there. That's kind of funny. Or these Nikon rangefinder cameras, which if you can get your hands on one of them, are just so beautiful. And I love the lens mounts on these. And of course, the ubiquitous SLR that I think everyone grew up with and thought of. And, um, some people still think, SLR is the way to go. And, they would never imagine using a rangefinder or anything with a waist level or ground glass. And there's pros and cons. Of course, people shooting flash complain that when the mirror goes up, you don't get to see things and all of that. But then again, as you switch lenses out, everything looks kind of beautiful. You can see what it looks like in and out of focus, and get preview of depth of field and all these sorts of things. And a lot of people, especially I find like a lot of young photographers who going into digital, they have this aspirational quality of trying to get an SLR, thinking that's the way to go. Although maybe mirrorless is kind of breaking into that market a little bit now for them, but still. And then there's this whole point and shoot world of like high end kind of point and shoot, like this Context T3, where you want to have it, you want to have the quality lens, you want to have this, but you don't want to make all the decisions. You want to be able to keep it in your pocket. This sort of became the other kind of street photography, ubiquitous party photography camera for a while. And there's like a little lower end quality of the point and shoot. And we'll talk about this Ricoh in terms of Daido Moriyama, perhaps. What was your first camera? I had a little cartridge camera was my first one for sure. Little ridiculous, sexy, rolly ad. And then half frame cameras, they had that period. I think they've sort of fallen out of favor, but I have a couple friends who have used these where you get 72 photographs off of one roll of film. Uh, of course, it's lower resolution, lower quality, but then it's this tiny little package and you're not maybe as precious with it. And so how does that affect the photographs you make, knowing that you're, just going to get to go through a whole roll, right? Had to throw in some specialty cameras like the Minox. I can't think of a single artist who used these Minox cameras for anything. So I hope maybe one of you is going to chime in and say, oh yes, this was, there's the great Minox photographer. Other than James Bond, I don't know anyone I've ever seen use it. So something to think about is like, what can we do with these specialty format cameras that maybe you wouldn't do with anything else, including like an underwater camera like the Nikonos. This was from last week when I was talking about the Russian FT2 that I had. I couldn't remember what the model number was. This is that camera, this FT2. Of course, stereo, the bastard stepchild of photography, which hardly ever gets spoken about, but certain unless you go to the right forums. But there's the Kodak stereo camera. And then, so if we think of those as sort of like a range of types, I think this certainly for musicians, the aspirational quality of trying to think of, oh, I just heard, such and such is my favorite guitarist, favorite songwriter. He uses a Stratocaster. I've got to go get that same Stratocaster. I want to use it. And I think there is that quality in photography too, where like, if you love Deanne Arbus's work, if you've seen this photograph of her, you're probably going to go at least look at a Mamiya C330, if not, buy one, they're cheap enough, and start shooting it yourself, right? When I was reading Edward Weston's day books and thinking about 8x10, I had this 5x7 camera already at that point, but that was the first kind of tickle that, oh, wait, maybe I should be making 8x10s and contact printing them. Maybe 5x7's not enough. Looking at Stephen Shore's work, looking at Sally Mann, all these people shooting 8x10 in large format started to really definitely had an influence on me, even though I was already shooting large format, to think about, where could I go? What should I do? Should I buy another camera, right? This is Sudek from last week again with his large format camera. Or here's good old Ouija with his press camera. I know a lot of people who love Ouija, love that idea of still shooting large format, but being out in the world with flash and wandering the streets of New York and Boston with their press cameras and trying to recreate that kind of world. So that's still, I think, part of why people reach for those cameras. And of course, good old Blow Up, if you haven't seen that movie, the movie that launched 1,000 photo careers. And that scene where he's in the studio with that Hasselblad cranking that thing around. And then later, in the park shooting with 35 millimeter. And of course, you liked Winogrand, Friedlander, Helen Levitt. I don't have a picture with her Leica, but those photographers, you were going to probably go try to put your hands on a Leica or at least a rangefinder 35 millimeter and try to get out in the streets and see if you could recreate the stuff they were doing with it, right? And I know for sure, I spoke to a couple camera stores in New York when I was there, that after the Vivian Maier documentary came out and people started looking at her work, that Rolleiflexes on eBay and everything else went through the roof. Everyone's like, oh, I've got to get me one of these Rolleiflexes. And so that aspect is a big part of it. Here's Daido Moriyama with that Ricoh, was it a GR1 or GR2? I forget, GR1, I think. But then now talking about the feedback that you get from these cameras, it's not just like, okay, I want the same camera that person was using, but what's inherent in the camera itself that gives me something that I can think about. But the first kind of obvious way I thought about it was, what's the viewfinder, right? Are we looking through the glowing ground glass, this upside down image with the dark cloth under us, and looking at this, beautiful, large, moving version of the image? Something about the way it goes on that ground glass just is very seductive. Or one of these other ground glass where, like the waist level viewfinders, even on the Nikons, you can pull off the top and look down in that ground glass and still see that kind of flipped view of the world. Looking through your SLR rangefinder, the SLR viewfinder with that prism in the middle and seeing things go in and out of focus, how's that going to be affecting you? Or do you have a bright line system like this where you get to, and I think one of the things I find so attractive about having bright lines is that you get to see what's going to be in the final photograph, assuming that your bright lines are pretty close, but you also get to see outside of the frame, above and below, left and right. And so you have maybe a better idea of what you're choosing to leave in and leave out. Here's a funny ad from the manual for a Leica M3 showing the rounded corners of their bright line viewfinder. There's their rangefinder. Or forget all of forget being encumbered by the focusing screen at all and seeing the rangefinder and being distracted by all that. Maybe just, I've seen a lot of people putting these optical viewfinder, bright line viewfinders, even on their little point and shoot digital cameras, so that they are looking at the world and not looking at a screen, and they're unencumbered by focus, and they're making that decision completely separately. Or you could go to the total other end of the extreme and just have a sports finder, like on this Mamiya Press, where you're putting your eye up to this little black spot and looking through a mask, either metal or paper, and having no optics involved at all. It's just, you can do that with the Crown Graphic. You can do it with almost any of these cameras, or make your own. And then you're just really literally looking at the world and not thinking about the way the optics are getting involved, right? So I think that those aspects of what's the viewfinder look like, how does it look when you put it up to your eye and look at the world, have a great effect on it. But also, what's the aspect ratio? Are you seeing a square? Are you seeing a rectangle? Are you seeing like the more cinematic, like 6:9 and 35, or even those more extreme formats to get that more sweeping view of a rectangle? It certainly is going to affect where you stand, the relationship you have between things. I know for myself, like when I was shooting with this 5x7 camera behind me for a long time, I just automatically stepped to the distance away from something, knowing that the relationship between them was going to put such and such on the right, this other thing on the left, and that it was going to balance out the rectangle. I just, I kind of inherently brought that in. And when I went back to shooting 4x5, I was kind of shocked about that extra kind of squat nature of 6.7 or 4.5. Really felt like I didn't even know how to make a picture. I wound up going to square for a while just to sort of even it out, right? So that definitely is a huge feedback part of it. And then what are the controls like? Like my main camera now is this Cyclops that I built with Tom Roma and Dennis Santella, and it's all scale focus. There's no focusing mechanism, so it's scale focus. It's big and kind of bulky compared to some stuff, but it certainly taught me stuff about my built-in biases when I was out photographing, always standing the same distance away from things. And then as I had to turn the lens to scale focus in and see that I was once again standing at 12 feet, it made me realize I wasn't, varying things enough. I wasn't getting up close. I wasn't going away. So just by the nature of the way the camera was designed, made me more hyper aware of where I was going with things, right? So, you know, is it utilitarian? Does it, can you easily set it up and bring it with you, or is it more complicated? I was traveling with this Deerdorf in Germany in 1994, and the wall hadn't been down very long. And not only would people get out of my way to make sure they weren't in my frame, but I had people come up and thank me for coming to their country and photographing. I mean, that's not going to happen if you come in with your iPhone and go to start taking pictures. People are just not going to have the same reaction to it. So how does that also tie into it, that camera, the relationship of whether or not you're covering your face or not? What does it look like, to the person you're photographing? Or even if you're not photographing people, if you're just out in the world, how are they going to react to? Are they going to think, oh, this person's very serious and they're going to leave them alone? Or are they going to think this person looks like a creep with their little, they're like scooting around and trying to sneak around? So it has an effect on how, people see you as well. But I think all of these things come together when we think about how you can place limitations on yourself to potentially push against these things to be more creative, right? Like one of the downsides to some of these great digital cameras, like the smartphone, is that it's able to work great in low light, and you're able to have it on you all the time. You're able to do this, you're able to do that. And so, other than some resolution issues, there's not a lot of restrictions. You can shoot video, you can shoot stills, you can change the aspect ratio, willy-nilly. And so then I think that you don't have that thing maybe to that restrictions to push against. I have I had a quote from, where is he? Uh, the enemy of art is the absence of limitations. Orson Welles apparently said that. But I mean, I think you can find over and over again. I've been watching YouTube videos recently on woodworking and building off the grid homes and all of these things. And somewhere in there, someone's going to talk about the tool, like, oh, I always use this Stanley #2 plane because it's the right size to do this job. Or, again, back to musical instruments. And they're talking about how that fuels what they're trying to accomplish. And that just by imagining what the tool can do and imagining how the limitations of the tool, those things combined together suggest the possibilities of what could be, what could be accomplished, right? Um, let's see, I was thinking about Walker Evans working on the subway with his little hidden camera. Sometimes the creative process comes into thinking about how to modify the cameras or how to change what they are to make them more like what you need. But in all those instances, I still feel like there's these limitations and there's this feedback coming from the camera about how you hold it. I spent one summer photographing in North Carolina with my 8x10 view camera, and I only brought 80 sheets of film with me for like a 3-week trip. And so I only had 80 photographs to make on that trip. And of course, as I went out and photographed, that had an effect. If I pulled out off the road with the car, set up the tripod, I wasn't going to take 5 exposures in one spot, because now I just used up 5/80ths of my potential for the next 3 weeks, right? So it slowed me down. Later, I went back with the Cyclops with a 6x7 back on it to make similar photographs, and I think I had 100 rolls of 120 film with me. So of course, those limitations were removed, and now I was much wilder with using the camera. I would jump over barriers and climb down into the kudzu, and I would try a bunch of different wild things that I never would have done with the 8x10, right? So it affects how you engage with the camera. It also affects how close and far away you get from things. All of these things tie back into it. And then the last bit I would say is that thinking of this ubiquitous smartphone kind of tool is that when it doesn't suggest to you other possibilities, I think it takes away a little bit from that part of your brain that you're going to use to push against these things. And likewise, if you're always using the same camera, like this, I didn't throw all my other cameras away when I made this camera. I still have the other ones and I picked them up. And I was reminded of, there's that kind of famous phrase of, if you only have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. I looked that up today. It's supposedly Abraham Maslow, I think is his name, American psychologist, came up with it, but it's been attributed to other people as well. But there's a sort of cognitive bias that can come in where, like I was mentioning earlier, when I was only shooting 5x7, everything kind of looked like a 5x7 photograph to me, or looked like a large format photograph, like very stoically set up. And I know everyone probably heard stories about people setting up their large format camera, then getting it all perfect, and then you kick the tripod to make it, off center, and like try to make it a little wilder looking. So there's ways of pushing and pulling against the inherent qualities of the cameras, but I think it's more interesting to think about how can we know what their character is and know what their quality is so intimately, like a master woodworker knows exactly what he can do with certain chisels or planes or whatever, so that as soon as you see an opportunity or you see something, you're going to jump on it because you know what you can do with that tool, right? And you know how you could push it, or how you could get creative to get around it. The early TV code, when everyone was worried about being too racy and Leave It to Beaver, and the parents had to sleep in separate beds and all of these things, they had to get very creative to think of how do we suggest intimacy without being able to show what they do now is everyone gets naked and practically has sex on camera, right? So those limitations are possibilities. And I think someone can make you the argument that there are inherent limitations in using a smartphone or those sorts of things, and that they would find a very creative impulse for how to push against that. Maybe I'm not the best person to speak to that, but anyways, so that was my list, and I thought that would sort of set the tone. I'd love to hear from people have other experiences like the one I had, where I discovered something that I was limiting myself on, that are some trope that I kept doing because I wasn't, because the camera was sort of making it invisible to me. And then by switching things up, I became more aware of something, or about this sort of kind of aspirational qualities of, oh yes, I had to buy that camera because X, Y, or Z reason. Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great to hear that. So I think everyone's muted, so you'll have to unmute to speak up, but I'll open it up now for whoever wants to talk about any of that kind of stuff.
I'm curious about disappointments too. When you brought up that Hasselblad, I never bought one, but I borrowed one from work maybe 2 years ago. And I was so disappointed after all the hype. I was like, this is not interesting at all. I'd much prefer using a Rolleiflex. And I used to have one of those GR1 cameras too. And that was another big disappointment. It's like, I didn't see what the purpose of it was, or that it added anything, or let me see anything differently, or made things easier or better or harder. Like and the 645, I always hated 645. When I tried using it, I was like,
yeah.
Why is the
the shape of the frame is great. It's just the negatives just might as well be a 35mm frame at that point.
Yeah. Well, you have to turn sideways to get a normal format.
Yeah, well, that's a design flaw. That's it. No, the disappointment I had was with the plow belt. To be honest with you, the 670. Everything about it screamed it's a great camera, and all the people he used it from, like Robert Adams to Paul Graham, which are like almost two different ends of the spectrum, love that camera, and it's just like, this thing is not right. There's problems with it.
Kai, I'm going to have to leave you, but I'll see you next week. But I think it's a really interesting topic. What is your relationship with your camera?
My
So,
personal relationship or just in general, the idea?
no, I think in general,
Yeah.
well, you personally, me personally, but
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting topic that you surfaced. And I'm sorry I have to leave you, but I'll see you next week.
Great, Lisa. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
What was
I
the other?
remember this. I can't seem to find it. I went looking for it. Gil Perez has this quote where it's like, camera is language. So when you use a Leica with a 28, you're speaking a particular dialect. But even if you then change that lens, say to a 35, your dialect changes, which is, very French, I think. Uh, and, kind of interesting. I mean, for me, I worked in newspapers. I always wanted the Leica. I finally got the Leica. It had a 35. It was amazing. And then the paper I was at went digital, and that was a whole other. Early digital photography was a nightmare. But yeah, this idea of, I like to think of the M6 as or the M in general as like the Les Paul, Jimmy Page's Les Paul probably. But it is sort of fascinating. And I found going to grad school, I always really pushed back against this idea of the tripod photographer, shall we say, saying, well, I can look at a scene and I know it's it. I'm like, okay, and they're like, well, you should have like kind of worked this a little bit more. And I'm like, well, I looked at the scene, I knew it was it. So it's this idea of like, if I don't have a tripod, that idea doesn't hold as much weight or something. I don't know, probably biases. But interesting, interesting
Yeah,
topic.
I think the idea is sometimes the camera is going to force you to slow down, and sometimes the camera is going to allow you to be kind of wild and free, right? And so depending on maybe what your hang up is or what you've been doing for a long time, maybe it's you switch back and forth just to keep that muscle flexed. I made a modification to the panorama to be I wanted to photograph people from the forehead to the chin, but I thought, oh, I'll just put a longer lens on. That didn't work. So I wound up having to do all these extension tubes and everything. And once that was done, the only way I could get focus on somebody is I had a rope tied from the back of the camera with a knot in it. And so I'm photographing people and they have to hold the knot next to their eye. So that will be in focus, and then they have to drop it out of the frame. Well, that totally changes your relationship to the person you're photographing. They're having to do this and be still, and it slowed everything down. And I found it kind of amazing. It was like not the same as large format, but it was interesting to do it that way.
It's interesting you figured that out, because in the old school analog days of motion pictures, for pulling focus, for focusing on action, one of the tricks was every once in a while you'd end up on in a golf cart or something and leading somebody. And if in motion pictures, DPs want to use go wide open. Oh, you shoot wide open. Even in the brightest of sunlight, you throw a ton of ND in front of the lens and shoot wide open anyway to blur out the background. And one of the tricks was you'd take a rope and you'd put knots in it at every 2 feet or 5 feet or whatever you think it was, and you trail it behind the vehicle that you're in. And if the actors walk closer or further, you could just tell by the knots as to where they were, which is, you came up with the same solution. It's pretty good.
Yeah,
but well, you said something interesting, which is because I've gone from 35 millimeter up to like really big cameras, like 11x14s, which is like my main camera the last couple of years or so. And my battle with the tripod and view cameras is loosening it up. I mean, that's, just not being able to hand hold it and muscle it around. And I've gone to the point of putting shoes on the top of my view cameras and putting bright line finders on them for framing. And that it's something about looking on the ground glass that's upside down on a tripod that your brain just wants to square everything up.
Plus, a lot of the ground
battle.
glasses have a grid on them, and there's a grid on that ground glass, and you can adjust the things.
Grids I always get rid of, but there's also the fall off on the lenses on the view cameras, so that basically it's dimmer around the edges. So you end up putting things in the middle because you can see them clearer. It's a subconscious act, I think. And after a while, you realize you're doing it, and that's like, okay, how do I fix this? Because I want to make a wilder frame.
Well, I
And
think the same thing happens to people when they first start shooting 2.25, is it's so easy to put everything dead center in the square, right?
right.
So
Oh
it's
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
how do you break away from that? What tricks do you come up with to try to make a more interesting frame? Yeah.
Along the lines of framing, right now I'm working on a TV show that's both shot in horizontal and vertical. So it really makes me think of, instead of having to go into edit and having everything in like the rule of thirds, I have to sort of compromise. And it really makes me think of framing in a different way, because I don't want to have to scoot the frame every time an editor has to go into the edit room. So it really makes me think I have to be conscious about, okay, if I'm interviewing a subject, I want them to be like sort of here, so then it'll be framed. Same thing with action shots. When I'm sort of, looking at footage that other people have shot, I'm like, which are the best photos or videos that I can use to best, relay this both on the horizontal and the vertical. And just having those two limitations really just makes me look at the composition of an image in a very different way now. It's really interesting.
And that has to do a lot with what you were saying with the, with the iPhone, because as technology progresses, because the iPhone, you can, vertical, horizontal, and that's where our new demands and limitations are coming in now, so.
Yeah, that's that new, is that, I don't know how to pronounce it, Quibi or Kibi or whatever that is. Is that format? No? Oh, we lost you. I think your internet locked up. But I was reading how that video format was, the whole thing is that you can watch it vertically or horizontally. So I'm imagining that's what you're using. Who else? Tony, you have a bunch of cameras. What's something that you've had to change because of that? I got to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I have to change my eyes.
Mm.
I think that you were talking about the half frame, and I thought that was really interesting because it's basically the same format that most iPhones are, which is portrait style, not landscape. So I remember using the half frame a lot, just because I wanted to save money and get more pictures in a roll of 36. But you learn how to make good verticals with the half frames. But I mean, I've been doing other things. I've been actually getting rid of a lot of cameras that I don't use. So if I'm not using it for a year, I get rid of it. And so now I'm down to like 5, and that's it. I'm sure you have a lot more than that, Kai.
Really, that plow bell is the only one I regret ever having. Don't regret ever having gotten rid of. Every camera I've ever sold, I regret not having again.
I don't know. I just feel sorry about. I mean, I don't feel sorry, but I feel that if I have a camera that's sitting for more than a year and it's not being used, I would prefer to give it to a student and see if they can make some good work with it. I mean,
Yeah, the regret.
My age right now, where I'm trying to get rid of things and not accumulate things.
Yeah. I was just reminded of a mutual friend who got really excited about the Leica, and he bought like the sharpest lenses he could get for it, and then he got then he's like, oh, I got to get the Zeiss lenses. The Leica lenses aren't good enough, and it went on and on and on. And then he just realized after years and spending all this money that he just didn't like the look of 35, that he preferred 120. He didn't like the grain. He didn't like all the things that make 35 do what it does. He just couldn't handle it. And he wound up selling everything off with like no regrets, just like, but that going back to this idea of like all of these photographers that he admired used that tool, and he was just determined to try to get it to work. And then, realized it just wasn't for him, and that maybe that's also valuable. You try something out, you have all these ideas, you buy the Les Paul guitar, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, I really want a classical guitar, and this isn't right for me. But you have to try it out and see if it works.
I know that you're talking about cameras, but I can say that a 6x7 on an 8x10 print just looks wonderful.
Yep, sure.
So,
Well, that's the next part of it, of course, is like
right.
knowing, Yeah, I didn't really talk about that part of it, but of course, if you're shooting 8x10 and you know you're going to make a 20x24 print or something, then you also know that it's okay to have something this small in the frame, because when you look at the print, you're going to see it. If you're shooting a half frame, you know, Olympus pen half frame, and you're making an 8x10 print, then things have to be much bigger and graphic. Otherwise, it's just going to be, you know, 5 shades of little blurry dots in the corner. So that's another part of the feedback and how close you have to be and what tool you're using. I also think is interesting. We're about 45 minutes in. Anyone else have any other like examples or stuff we want to throw in, or we'll get off pretty soon otherwise?
Well, the one thing that I would like to say is that shooting different cameras, the way that the light records on the film, it really is a big difference. Like the Cyclops, the way that it records the shadow areas, I've never seen it in any other camera. So, I mean, I shoot a Mamiya 7, but the Cyclops, there's something about it that the way that it records the shadow areas, I've never seen anything like it.
It might be the
You think-
round body, you know, might be the round body and the way the light falls off in that round body, just making it that you get less flare and less stuff happening in the shadows. I'm not sure.
No, it could be the lens too. The Mamiya lenses, or the older ones, especially that 65, is not as crunchy as a new modern Mamiya lens.
Yeah, that's true too.
One other thing I think is important to mention is, like you were saying with musical instruments and the like different places they're used, is I think it makes a big difference when you find like maybe the musical comparison would be like a song that guitar is perfect for. But you know, you learn how to use these different tools and different cameras, and at some point I think you find something that is perfect for that device. You know, like I felt that way with the Panorama or with the Sights camera we were talking about last week, is I found something that I knew suited it, and then you realize, oh, this is something I can really do with this instrument, and it kind of takes off and becomes something different. You know, it's one thing to have the camera and you love it, and maybe you love the format and you know admire other photographers who've used it, but when you find a project to work on that you feel like what you learned about the camera and the way it works feeds into what you're trying to do with it, that's really, I think, when things kind of come together and it becomes more, you know, more useful and more meaningful, where like the instrument suits the end.
Yeah, and there's no way you're going to find that out unless you spend time with the instrument, right? So you have to like pick it up and really learn what it's doing to get lucky.
You practice with the guitar. I think that's an interesting way of like calling a camera an instrument. It's something that you practice with. You know, if you photograph, I'm sure all of us photograph sometimes not really for any particular end, but it keeps you in practice and keeps you aware of the possibilities of it.
Dennis, I really liked what you said, but I think that unlike an instrument, like a musical instrument, how photography is more unique in that sense is that the instrument is also dictating people's relationship to you. Not just about how to produce a photograph. It's also what kind of camera do you use that creates a certain dialogue with the environment as well, which is less so with guitars when you think about it.
Maybe, although if we go back to that Joan Jett picture, I mean, if you're in like a heavy metal band or something, you're going to have a certain guitar. It's going to look a certain way. If you walk out with a hollow body guitar, you know, people are going to throw rocks at you or something.
But the question, if you know, if I work with a 4x5 versus if I work with a Leica, your relationship with people changes and people's response to you changes. You know, it's not just about how big is your negative and how quick it is to, you know, photograph. You know, this proved me again and again that, you know, photographing people with a 4x5 is heaven and earth with 35. You know.
Oh, it's like
yeah, because you're not. No, go ahead.
I was just saying, it's like having a piano or a harmonica. It's like, it's not all about guitars. I don't even play a musical instrument, so I'm just working with the analogy. You guys keep going.
No, but for what for Yoav said, I mean, it's actually dead on, because especially if you're going out in the world. I mean, a lot of us go and just wander the streets and find things and experience it that way, and then come across somebody you want to photograph or whatever. You're shooting with a small camera. There's always the implication that you're grabbing something, you're taking something. You can't hide with a big view camera. You can't be surreptitious with it, with the tripod and stuff. So you have to engage people, and then it changes the way you make the picture. But depending on the subject matter. I mean, just for me, right before all this insanity started, I've been working on a project in LA documenting these shelters that people have set up constantly everywhere. Los Angeles has an incredibly bad homeless problem. And there's these structures, these temporary structures. And I had to go back and forth for a long time figuring out, okay, how am I going to shoot this? And because of the nature of this thing, that people are homeless and they have nothing as it is, shooting with a small camera just is not viable, because then I don't want to go in there and not have to have a conversation with somebody and even ask their permissions to take the pictures. And so at least with a big camera, it's on a tripod, I'm there. And then you can start the engagement. And so that determined how I'm shooting that stuff. And I think that's a part of it.
Yeah, the building off of both, what you guys both said, I'm sure everyone's had the experience too, where you take the camera out and people look at it and they realize, oh, you're serious, and that this isn't just like maybe every other experience they've had with someone taking their picture, they're maybe other than getting their ID picture made. It's always been, especially now, it's like happy, snappy, whatever, and selfies and all the stuff that's going on. But a lot of people, most people have never had their portrait made with a 4x5 camera. So, when Yoav pulls that out, and it's not only the relationship to you, but the relationship to the experience they're having, right? And I think every camera could have a different reaction and put people in a different place that way, which is why I like those contexts, G3s, people like them for the fact that they make, they have beautiful quality and resolution, but people think of them as sort of point and shoot happy snaps, and or maybe put their guard down in a different way than if you were pulling out, something that looked more expensive.
As we are kind of all photo dorks, and it is very relevant, even Paul Strand, and you're talking about like 1915. Yeah, his thing was that I want to have pictures of people not aware of being photographed. And this is how that's how he built his mock camera. And then you're looking, 20 years later, Walker Evans, every time he photographs people, it doesn't matter how small they are in the picture, they're always in contact with him. You always see that they recognize his existence. And then 10 years later, he's building a camera that he wants to take pictures on the subway without people knowing that he's there. He's actually, recognizing the importance of the recognition in terms of what type of pictures you're making, which is very much so what we actually just talked about. That it's a two-way street. It's not just the instrument. It's also what it's dictating back and forth from the world.
Right. I mean, like Helen Levitt too. A lot of those pictures in A Way of Seeing were shot with a right angle viewfinder. So she was standing with her body pointing in a different direction, 90 degrees off from where the action was, just so people the kids wouldn't notice her so much.
Or Gary Winogrand's, little thing with the hand that he kept on doing. You're not really sure when he's taking the picture,
How I view, like when I selected, because I have a Hasselblad with also a Nikon. I bought the Hasselblad because of you, Kai. And then also the digital Nikon D750, and all three different have a purpose. But also like with piggybacking, hopefully that's the reason why I want the rangefinder, because everybody, when they hear the click, everybody snaps their heads real quick. But also what I've learned also is like I use the Hasselblad, it's got to be slower, because for my audience, I don't want their eyes to go left and right. Right. And then with let's just say with the 35mm, then I want more of the landscape type picture. And then with the D750, I remember I needed that digital because it was easier because I was shooting an MMA fight, but they allowed us to go into the center of the ring. So I was able to get really nice portraitures of them before they wiped off the blood. But, you know, they had to wipe off the blood because they want them to, their fighters to look good in front of the judge. But I had to get into that ring really fast. And that's where the digital really popped nicely. But like, also just hearing all this.
Oh, we lost you for a second there, Eric.
Still.
You hear me?
Now we hear
Got
you
me?
again. Yeah.
Okay. So like also, but there's, I think there's also a balance between technique and just also getting a shot, because even so I pulled this up just before this because I read about this a while ago, and it was a photographer in the 19th century, and where was it? It was James Mudd. He was English. He also presented a paper called Photographer's Dreams at Manchester Literary, and based.
Oh, your connection's terrible, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. It was real quick. It was like when you said pixel counting, he said the same thing in the 19th century. His goal was to see photography valued as one of the fine arts, but photographers obsessed with chemical processes and optical devices undermine this ambition. So I think there's also a really fine balance into techniques and, you know, our tools to also ultimately our visions too. So we can't, you know, pixel count, as you said to me a long time ago, like probably 5 years ago.
Ted, I was wondering if you could just speak to the fact that I know you're like modifying a camera right now and trying to like make your own little like mix between two different cameras, and that might be also an interesting thing to touch on. Is
I'm working on several cameras right now, but I'm trying to convert old Polaroid cameras back into film cameras, which is going okay. But I've also, along the way, found these old Zeiss folding cameras from the 20s that I'm now trying to modify. And then I have this is something I was thinking about in terms of, I mean, I'm working with a lot of weird cameras. I'm working with imperfect cameras because I'm kind of sick of, I have Leicas and Rolleiflexes. I can make perfect pictures. I'm kind of tired of perfect photographs. So I'm trying to push the boundaries a little bit with the actual instrument and what its capabilities are. And one of the cameras I'm working with that I used to work with is an old passport camera. And I used to use it with type 665 Polaroid positive negative. I could make a diptych on one piece of film. However, the limitation of the camera is it only focuses at 3 feet. So now I've got a ground glass on one of those, and I'm playing around.
great. Yeah.
It's all, you know, busy work during this time to kind of keep me occupied. But I'm excited by the process and by pushing the boundaries. And I'm not trying to be crafty, but I mean, I'm using good lenses, but it's very problematic in my mathematical skills. It's a lot of trial and error.
Great.
Yeah, that's what I've been up to.
Yeah, so if you follow Ted on Instagram, you can see him putting some of these things together. I've been admiring your desk setup with all everything laid out.
It's a lot of junk. You can still get stuff on. You can get stuff on eBay very cheap right now, by the way. So,
What's your Instagram handle?
Ted Barron, BARRON.
Great. All right, we're just hitting the 1 hour mark, which I think is a good time to call it a day. I want to thank everyone for joining in and bringing stories and talking about cameras. And it's also just great to connect with everyone while we're self-quarantining. So that's also an extra bonus. And so I got a topic in mind for next week, I'll announce it, and I hope to see all of you there too. Thank you very much for showing up.
Hey,
Appreciate it.
Dennis.
Thanks,
See
guys.
ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kai.
Bye.
Bye.
Much less frustrating Zoom than the one earlier in the week, right, Michael?
Yeah, yes, it was. Far fewer people.
Yes.
That helps. All
Thanks,
right.
Kai. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Kai.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Later.
Bye.
Hey, Kai, real quick. Do you know Bobby McFerrin?
Yeah.
I was listening to him, and you brought up this whole concept of music and music instrument. Boy, I strive to use my camera the way he uses his body and his voice.
Yeah, that's something to strive for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Amazing. All right, man.
All right, Tony, take care.
All right, dude, take care.
Nice seeing you,
Dennis.
Tony.
Nice seeing you, Dennis.
See you, James.
God, did you catch your pack rats yet?
I got a couple of them. All right. Bye.
Good job, Kai.
Thanks, Michael.